Now, we've mentioned this a couple times of an ILIT is a type of IDGT. And you may be wondering of why don't I just set up an IDGT? The typical kind of approach is to set up an ILIT as its own standalone entity. We want to just kind of chat through and maybe Peter, let's dive into
Yeah.
why do people set up ILITs as standalone vehicles for their insurance versus just bundling it with their traditional with an IDGT?
Yeah. So there's a few reasons. The thing that comes up the most that I see is people who have existing trusts that, for whatever reason, can't own insurance. Sometimes the provisions of the trust agreement or they're missing provisions that you'd want to include in a trust that's owning insurance. There's a special tax provision called Section 2042 that deals with the estate tax consequences of owning insurance policies. And so you want to make sure that the trust agreement is consistent with that language. And then the other reason, which goes to point 3 on the slide, is that non-grantor trusts usually can't hold life insurance. And so if you're trying to set up a non-grantor trust, for example, like say you're trying to avoid California income tax and you want to set up a South Dakota non-grantor trust, it doesn't really make sense to try to combine the non-grantor trust with the ILIT because the ILIT can't be a non-grantor trust in most cases. And so if you're trying to do the non-grantor trust and the trust with insurance, you really want to have two separate trusts there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the other piece I'd add on is, so one is you don't really want to, it doesn't make sense with the non-grantor trust. There's also still like, why do you segregate it from a typical IDGT? Almost like you think of it like hygiene or kind of best practice of just separating. Insurance is a very particular type of asset and just putting its own trust. There's the hygiene of separating these types of investment assets versus insurance, but there's also just cost. ILITs, while they are a type of IDGT, if they just have insurance inside of them, they are much cheaper to administer, which means it's lower cost. It's easier to decide to set that up. It's a lower burden on you or your clients if you're deciding to move that forward with that route versus with an IDGT, it's significantly more expensive. And so as a result, it's more overhead and it means there's a kind of a higher burden as to deciding if it's worthwhile or not versus an ILIT. For instance, we'll do those as administer those as low as $1,000 a year, which, you're looking at typical policy sizes isn't really that consequential and becomes relative to the benefits, much more of a no-brainer.